In mid-September 1944, the Baltic operation of Soviet troops was still gaining momentum when a decision was already made at Adolf Hitler's headquarters that sealed the fate of nearly 300,000 German soldiers. Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner, commander of Army Group North, requested permission to withdraw troops through the port of Riga, while the corridor still existed, while the roads could still bear the weight of equipment, before the Baltic Sea closed with autumn storms. Berlin refused. The troops below continued to hold positions along the entire line from Tallinn to Riga, unaware that their further fate had already been decided not in local headquarters, but in a single office in East Prussia. For the command, there were airfields, staff aircraft, and orders to evacuate valuable specialists. For the divisions, only autumn mud, swamps, and a front that tightened with each passing day. Why was there an escape route for some, but none prepared for the others? To understand this, one must return to the summer of 1944, to the moment when the trap was just beginning to be set, and the German command theoretically still had time to make a different decision. The summer of 1944 destroyed the German Eastern Front on a scale not even dreamt of after Stalingrad. Operation Bagramyan, the Soviet summer offensive that began on the 23rd of June 1944, ground down Army Group Center in 8 weeks. 28 divisions ceased to exist as combat units. Of approximately 800,000 soldiers in the ranks by August, barely 350,000 remained combat effective, and that included reserves hastily transferred from other sectors of the front. But behind the dry numbers lies a specific catastrophe. General Kurt von Tippelskirk's 4th Army was encircled in the Minsk area. General Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Army was cut into pieces and pushed north. General Hans Jordan's 9th Army effectively ceased to exist as an organized force by mid-July. Soviet mobile columns advanced at a speed which the German command had declared physically impossible just weeks before it became reality. The pace of the breakthrough, previously associated with German wedges of 41, now belonged to Soviet tank corps. 200,000 German soldiers were captured just during the defeat near Minsk. 200,000! That is the population of a large regional center. It is more than the entire 6th Army that capitulated at Stalingrad a year earlier. And this did not happen over months of positional warfare, but over several weeks of open maneuver warfare, in which the German command was repeatedly late in its reaction by exactly the amount the enemy needed for success. At this time, Army Group North held positions in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Its right flank rested on the Gulf of Finland. Its left stretched towards the border with East Prussia through Lithuania. 3 armies, the 18th under General Ernst Laus, the 16th under General Karl Hilpert, and the operational group Narva under General Johannes Friesner. Total strength, according to German record-keeping data from the Army Group's combat journals, about 700,000 men, including auxiliary units, construction battalions, and rear services. Combat effective, ready for maneuver warfare, significantly fewer. According to an assessment by the Army Group staff made at the end of July 1944, there were roughly 180,000 active bayonets. This grouping held positions that, under other circumstances, could have been considered exemplary from the point of view of tactical defense. The Narva Line, a narrow neck between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Peipus. The front width here was about 30 kilometers, less than that of an average army corps in open terrain. The line had been held since the beginning of 1944. Months of engineering work had been invested in it. Permanent fortifications had been erected. Every fold of the terrain had been zeroed in. Soviet troops stormed Narva several times, and each time fell back with heavy losses. But Narva was a frontal line. The vulnerability of Army Group North lay not in front, but on the side and from below. Friends, we've realized our audience is growing rapidly, and we don't even know the geography of our viewers. Write right now in the comments which city or country you are from. We are incredibly interested to read, and we'll also see where we are being watched from most often. Thank you. The collapse of Army Group Center did not just open a hole in the defense. It exposed the right flank of Army Group North from the south. Now, Soviet troops could strike not head-on at the fortified positions along Narva or Lake Peipus, but into the rear, through Lithuania, reach the Baltic Sea, and cut off the entire grouping at once. The distance from the front line in the Belarus area to the Baltic coast in the Memel area was about 400 kilometers as the crow flies. Soviet mobile formations, having already proven their ability to cover 50 kilometers per day, could cover this distance in less than 2 weeks, provided no one stopped them. And there was no one to stop them. German reserves had been exhausted in Belarus. And that is exactly what happened. The Soviet command understood the geometry of this trap before Berlin agreed to acknowledge the threat. Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army Alexander Vasilevsky, as early as the beginning of August 1944, insisted on striking precisely through the Baltics, not frontally, but with an advance to the sea. The plan was transparent to the point of harshness. Not to waste strength storming the fortified Narva line, but to bypass it, cutting it off from supply. A starving army will surrender on its own. An army without ammunition will surrender faster. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, whose troops were completing the defeat of the German Army Group Center in Belarus, simultaneously turned his left flank north, towards East Prussia and the Baltic coast. This was not a separate decision, but part of a single operational concept developed by the Soviet command even before the completion of Bagration. The Belarusian operation and the Baltic operation are not two separate events. This is one strategic maneuver, in which Bagration created the conditions for the second blow, and the second blow sealed the enemy grouping from the north. By mid-1944, the Soviet General Staff had learned to look not one move, but 3 moves ahead. The German command in the Baltics saw this. Colonel General Georg Lindemann, who commanded Army Group North during that period, reported to Berlin about the threat of being cut off as early as July. His assessment was simple to the point of cruelty. If Soviet troops reached the Baltic Sea south of Riga, the entire Army Group North would find itself on a peninsula without land communication with the rest of the front. The only way out was an immediate retreat through Riga, followed by evacuation or an organized withdrawal into East Prussia along the coast. Lindemann proposed a specific plan: the withdrawal of the 18th Army from Estonia to Riga, using the railway lines while they were still operational. Simultaneously, the 16th Army would retreat westward, toward the Lithuanian border, while holding a narrow corridor along the coast. Evacuation of heavy equipment by sea, the Baltic fleet at that time still possessed sufficient forces to organize transport convoys. According to the calculations of the Army Group staff, this maneuver would have taken 3 to 4 weeks, would have required serious pressure on the retreating columns, but would have allowed the bulk of the troops to be withdrawn without catastrophic losses. Hitler rejected this report. Lindemann was relieved of command. In his place, Schörner was appointed, a man known for his personal harshness and readiness to carry out orders without objection. This too was a signal. Berlin did not want to hear realistic assessments. Berlin wanted to hear that the positions would be held. Schörner's appointment itself spoke volumes. Ferdinand Schörner was an officer whose career was built on strict execution of orders and personal loyalty to Hitler. His practice included a system of field tribunals operating directly in the combat zone. A soldier accused of abandoning his position without orders could be shot within a few hours. Schörner personally toured rear units and sent those he considered to be shirking combat to penal battalions. Such a commander would not request a withdrawal. Such a commander would shoot for it. That was precisely what Berlin needed. On the 17th of August 1944, something occurred that the Army Group North staff considered almost impossible within such a time frame. Soviet mobile formations of the First Baltic Front, under the command of Army General Ivan Bagramyan, reached the Baltic Sea in the Memel and Palanga area. The land corridor connecting Army Group North with the rest of the front through Lithuania was severed. The 17th of August. Remember this date. Bagramyan threw the 1st Tank Corps and motorized rifle units into the breakthrough. They passed through German positions in Lithuania without stopping to clear their flanks. It was a risk. The breakthrough formations found themselves deep in the German rear, with stretched supply lines, vulnerable to a counterattack. But the German command had no reserves for such a counterattack. Army Group Center had been defeated. Army Group Northern Ukraine was battling the Soviet offensive on Lviv. There was nowhere to draw reserves from. The Soviet columns reached the sea. The corridor slammed shut. From this moment on, Army Group North was physically cut off from Germany by land. Any reinforcements, any ammunition, any fuel, only by sea or air. The sea route across the Baltic was operational, but its capacity was incomparable to the railway lines that had supplied the Army Group until then. A single double-track railway could handle up to 40 pairs of military trains per day, roughly 8,000 tons of cargo. The entire Baltic Sea route, at best, provided 3,000 tons. And that was under conditions of normal weather, and that was under conditions of functional port infrastructure, and that was under conditions where Soviet submarines did not sink transports en route. The air bridge, even less. By this time, the Luftwaffe did not control the airspace over the Baltic to the extent necessary to supply the encircled force. Soviet fighter aviation by the autumn of 1944 numerically outnumbered the German on the Eastern Front by approximately threefold. The Junkers 52 transport aircraft, the main workhorse of German aerial supply, carried about 2 tons of cargo. To transport 1,000 tons per day required 500 successful sorties. Given losses to fighters and anti-aircraft fire, this was unrealistic. The Germans managed to punch a temporary corridor in the Tukums area, a narrow neck along the shore of the Gulf of Riga. This occurred as a result of a counterattack in late August, early September. General Hermann Breit's 3rd Panzer Corps and units transferred from other sectors struck from the west to meet part of Army Group North's forces. Both sides suffered serious losses. The Germans lost men they could not replace. The Soviet troops lost equipment which they could replace faster. The corridor opened. But it was narrow, no more than 15 kilometers at its widest point, and it was swept by Soviet artillery fire from end to end. Some equipment was moved through it and limited supply deliveries were organized. Columns moved at night with headlights off, under constant artillery fire. Some vehicles burned right on the road, some reached their destination. By mid-October 1944, it had become clear. This corridor could neither be maintained for long nor provide full supply for 3 armies. In the autumn of 1944, the Soviet command launched the Baltic Strategic Offensive Operation in full scale. 3 Baltic fronts, the first under Bagramyan, the second under Yeryomenko, and the third under Maslenikov, plus Govorov's Leningrad front. Collectively, about 900,000 men in the first operational echelon, more than 17,000 guns and mortars, over 3,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, about 2,500 aircraft. This was not a single operation. It was a series of blows that methodically cut away the German defenses from different directions, preventing the Army Group North Command from determining where the main blow was being struck and where to transfer reserves. The Soviet command method by the autumn of 1944 no longer had anything in common with the chaotic frontal attacks of 41 or 42. It was a well-oiled machine that knew how to probe the defense, accumulate forces where a weakness was identified, and strike precisely at those points. The German command could still hold any individual line, holding all lines simultaneously, no longer. The first blow through Estonia and toward Tallinn. Soviet troops of the Leningrad front began their offensive in Estonia on the 17th of September, 1944. The German Narva Group began its retreat on the 22nd of September, even before Soviet troops entered the Estonian capital. The command made the decision to withdraw without waiting for encirclement, one of the few instances where the German command in the Baltic acted contrary to Berlin's directives. Tallinn fell on the 22nd of September, 1944. Here, the Germans managed to conduct a relatively organized sea evacuation of part of the troops, but only part. The fleet employed everything at hand: transports, barges, warships. Several thousand soldiers were transported. Equipment, heavy weaponry, supplies. A significant portion of this remained on the shore or was destroyed. The ships sailed under constant attacks by Soviet aviation. Several transports were sunk right in Tallinn harbor. People jumped into the icy waters of the Baltic. The second blow threw Latvia straight to Riga, the capital of Latvia, a major port city on the Daugava. From a military operational standpoint, the only port on this stretch of the Baltic through which Army Group North could theoretically evacuate by sea in an organized manner. A railway junction, a highway junction. the only major logistics center still controlled by German troops in the area. Schörner and his staff understood perfectly well that the city had to be either immediately used for the organized evacuation of heavy weaponry and part of the troops, or abandoned while the corridor still existed. Holding Riga without the ability to supply it, without the prospect of relief from outside, and without a strategic reserve made no operational sense whatsoever. Berlin insisted on holding. Hitler considered the Baltic states a bridgehead from which contact with Finland could be restored, although Finland had already left the war by that time, having signed the Moscow Armistice on the 19th of September, 1944. He considered the port of Riga a gateway for a winter counteroffensive that would retake the Baltic states. With what forces this counteroffensive would be carried out was not specified in Berlin. Schörner complied. The troops began to occupy defensive positions around Riga. Now let's look at the supply figures, because it was here that the mathematics said everything one needed to know about this decision. According to data from German rear services recorded in the reports of the Army High Command, the daily ammunition requirement of the three armies of Army Group North amounted to about 7,000 tons. The fuel requirement, about 4,000 tons per day, accounting for combat operations and vehicle maneuvers. Food, medicine, spare parts, several thousand tons more on top of that. The sea route across the Baltic could provide at best about 3,000 tons per day, provided there was normal weather, no losses from Soviet submarines and aviation, and uninterrupted operation of port infrastructure. 3,000 out of the 11,000 needed. 3,000 out of 11. That is 27% of the requirement, less than 1/3. This meant one thing. From the moment the land corridor was finally closed, Army Group North began consuming its own reserves. Every day of fighting meant a loss of several thousand tons from warehouses that could no longer be replenished in the required volume. Artillery fired less frequently because shells had to be conserved. Tanks stood idle. There was no diesel fuel. The wounded were evacuated late. There was no room on ships occupied by incoming cargo. The German general Erhard Raus described this situation with utmost precision in his memoirs published after the war. Supply across the Baltic was never calculated to sustain three armies in a mode of active defense. The Baltic route was a reserve, for replenishing specific stocks, but not for feeding and arming an entire army group under conditions of complete encirclement. But the most important thing in this arithmetic is not the overall deficit figures. What matters is the specific chain that this deficit triggered. When the battery of the 73rd Artillery Regiment of the 18th Army took up positions near Riga in early October 1944, its commander received a daily norm that sounded like a death sentence. 18 shells per gun. Not 80, not 40, 18. Under normal combat conditions, a battery of 4 guns expended that much in 1 good hour of work. Now this had to last a full day. This is not a detail or an isolated case. It is a direct consequence of the supply mathematics, reconstructed from combat logs stored in the German military archives. On the 6th of October 1944, Soviet troops began the assault on Riga. Bagramyan's First Baltic Front advanced from the south, Yeryomenko's Second Baltic Front from the east. Maslenikov's Third Baltic Front enveloped from the north. The German defense held for several days, professionally, stubbornly, with enormous losses for the attackers. Soviet assault battalions suffered heavy losses already on the approaches to the city. The suburbs of Riga were fortified with anti-tank ditches, obstacles, a network of bunkers and strongpoints. German artillery worked intensively, while there were shells. But there were fewer and fewer shells. On the second day of the assault, the density of German artillery fire dropped by half compared to the first day. On the third day, even more. This was noticeable to the commanders of Soviet assault groups right from the front line, where yesterday German batteries cut off approaches to fortified houses with continuous fire. Now they did so selectively, conserving every shot. Infantry without artillery cover is infantry that can be destroyed. Soviet assault groups knew this and exploited the windows of silence in the enemy's artillery. On the 13th of October 1944, Soviet troops entered Riga. German units withdrew to the west, across pontoon bridges. Across bridges they blew up behind them. The withdrawal was only partially organized. Part of the equipment remained on the eastern bank of the Daugava. Part of the personnel was cut off during the crossing. According to Soviet data, in the battles for Riga and on its approaches in October 1944 alone, German troops lost about 30,000 killed and captured, although these figures differ between German and Soviet sources. The troops of Army Group North withdrew to the Courland Peninsula. Courland, the western part of modern Latvia, a territory approximately 120 kilometers from west to east and about 70 kilometers from north to south at its narrowest point. To the east, Soviet troops. To the north and west, the Baltic Sea. There is no land exit. Here ended up the units and formations that constituted the backbone of three German armies. The strength of the grouping, which received the designation Army Group Courland, according to various estimates, about 215,000 combat-ready military personnel plus auxiliary units. The Soviet historian and military analyst Mikhail Myagkov, in his works based on German documentation from the German Federal Archives, cited precisely this figure: 215,000 personnel at the moment the pocket was finally sealed. 215,000. This is not a rifle division or a corps. This is a full-fledged army group. 215,000 men who, from October 1944 to May 1945, would sit in the Courland pocket, fighting for every kilometer of the peninsula, with no chance of changing the overall course of the war, no possibility of breaking out, and no operational sense. The Soviet command made 6 major attempts to liquidate the Courland pocket. 6 separate offensive operations from October 1944 to April 1945. All 6 were repelled. The first Soviet offensive into Courland from the 15th to the 22nd of October 1944. Bagramyan threw 3 armies against the newly formed Courland defense. Soviet troops broke through in several sectors, but could not hold the breakthroughs. The German command promptly moved reserves along short interior lines. This is the main tactical advantage of a pocket, which one usually does not consider until they find themselves inside it. The defender occupies a smaller perimeter than the attacker and can concentrate reserves where needed several times faster. The first offensive was repelled. The second offensive, in November 1944. The Soviet command attempted to use a different tactic: simultaneous strikes from several directions to disperse German reserves. Again, breakthroughs in individual sectors. Again, German counterattacks. Again, repelled. The second front was engaged in battles in Poland and East Prussia at this time, and the Soviet command simply did not have enough men for a decisive assault on Courland. The third offensive, in December 1944. By this time, the Soviet command had already begun withdrawing part of its forces from the Courland area to the main directions, the Polish and Berlin fronts. The remaining forces were sufficient for blockade and harassing attacks, but not for a decisive breakthrough. The third offensive was less extensive than the first 2, and was repelled with fewer losses for both sides. The German divisions, having settled into the rhythm of positional defense, were now operating almost automatically: counter-battery fire, clearing of breakthroughs, rotation by sector. The fourth offensive in January 1945. This occurred simultaneously with the start of the Vistula-Oder operation. Soviet troops near Courland attacked to tie down German forces and prevent the transfer of a single division to the Polish direction. The Germans held on. According to German operational reports cited by historian Dietrich Zehmann in his study Troops Without a Future, published in Frankfurt in 1993, the losses of Army Group Courland in the Fourth Soviet Offensive amounted to about 9,000 killed and wounded. Since the start of the encirclement, already close to 40,000. The Fifth Offensive, in February 1945, another attempt at a breakthrough, another repulsion. By this time, the German divisions in Courland had already lost a significant portion of their combat-ready strength, but the shrinking front made the defense even denser. A paradox. The more men the pocket lost, the easier it was to defend, simply because the line was contracting. The Sixth Offensive, in March 1945. The last major Soviet attempt to eliminate the pocket before the end of the war. It was also repelled. After this, the Soviet command finally switched to a strategy of blockade and attrition. Courland was no longer stormed. It was held in a ring, with no supplies allowed through, and they waited for the war to end overall. This is not a paradox or an accident. The German troops in Courland fought well, better than anywhere else on the Eastern Front during this period. The reason is simple. The pocket contained veteran divisions with combat experience, and positional defense on a narrow front requires significantly fewer resources than maneuver warfare. Ammunition could be saved. Fuel did not need to be expended. Reserves could be transferred from one sector to another along interior lines within a few hours. For the Soviet troops to break through this defense, a concentration of forces was required that was incompatible with simultaneously conducting operations in Poland, East Prussia, and on the Berlin direction. The Supreme High Command headquarters made a decision: to blockade Courland, not to storm it. The task was to prevent these troops from reaching the main direction, to exhaust their supplies, to wear them down in positional battles. It worked. 215,000 German soldiers spent the entire remainder of the war in Courland and made not the slightest contribution to the defense of Berlin, East Prussia, or Poland. Let us look at what was happening simultaneously on other sectors of the front, and then the absurdity of the Courland decision will become obvious in numbers. In January 1945, the Soviet Vistula Oder operation broke through the German defense in Poland. In 23 days, Soviet troops advanced 500 kilometers from the Vistula to the Oder. The German Eastern Front effectively collapsed. Hitler feverishly withdrew divisions from everywhere he could, from Hungary, from Italy, from Norway, and threw them to plug holes in the defense on the Oder. From Norway, where that winter there were about 300,000 German soldiers, guarding the coast from an Allied landing that could no longer happen. From Hungary, where Hitler still dreamed of operations to relieve Budapest. From Denmark, where large garrisons of occupation troops were engaged in what they no longer knew how to do, occupying a country that had long hated them and which no one was left to threaten. At this time, 215,000 men were stationed in Courland. If these troops had been evacuated in September, October 1944, when the Baltic route still allowed for an organized transfer, the German command would have had at its disposal a full-fledged army group, not exhausted by 6 Soviet offensives, not bled dry by positional battles, but combat-ready and equipped. Would it have been enough to change the overall course of the war? Unlikely. But these are full-fledged 12 to 15 divisions, which the Wehrmacht catastrophically lacked in the winter of 1945. Instead, they sat in Courland. What did life in the pocket look like technically? Here it is important to go beyond staff maps and look at what was happening at the level of a company, a platoon, an individual soldier. The winter of 44-45 in Courland was early and harsh. Snow fell in November. Frosts came earlier than usual. The trench system, hastily dug in October, was frozen solid by December. There were practically no dry bunkers. There was not enough wood for reinforcement, nor time for proper fortification of positions. Soldiers lived in earth that could not be heated to a normal temperature. Frostbite cases began in November. By December, the medical units of each division were receiving dozens of frostbite cases per week. Winter equipment was in short supply. It came by sea, along with ammunition and food, which meant insufficiently and irregularly. Obergefreiter Kurt Welter of the 290th Infantry Division wrote in a letter to his sister, quoted in a German collection of frontline letters published in Munich in the 70s, in December 1944. "We are holding on. Nails have turned black. There are no boots in my size. Everything that existed is already with others. I am wearing captured Soviet felt boots. They are warm." Captured Soviet felt boots on the feet of a German soldier in the Courland pocket, a small detail that speaks more about supply than 1,000 tons of consolidated statistics. Baltic supply functioned, but with constant interruptions. Soviet submarines and aircraft sank transport ships en route. Autumn and winter storms regularly disrupted sea communications for several days at a time. According to German naval documentation cited by historian Jürgen Rohr in his fundamental study of Baltic losses, in the autumn of 1944 alone, several dozen German transport ships engaged in supplying Courland were sunk or severely damaged in the Baltic Sea. The Soviet submarines of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet operated with increasing intensity. Each sunken transport was not just a cargo lost to the depths, it was a daily supply deficit accumulating day after day. One transport ship, 3 days without the standard ammunition allowance for 2 divisions. By the beginning of 1945, the ammunition issuance norm for units of Army Group Courland had been reduced to a quarter of the standard. This meant roughly the following. An artillery battery, which under normal conditions could fire all day in support of an infantry attack, in Courland was authorized to fire 20 shells in an entire 24-hour period. Not because the enemy was weaker, not because the front was quieter, but because there was no more. 20 shells per day for the entire battery, 5 shells per gun per day, 1 shot every 5 hours. A Soviet mortar crew, having targeted a German trench, would expend more mines in 1 short barrage. A German artillery commander could answer it exactly once per shift. The infantry held positions in trenches that had turned into frozen mud by winter. Medical supplies were expended faster than they arrived. The wounded were evacuated by sea, but not all, and not immediately. Hospital ships ran on schedule, and there were more wounded than places on them. Unteroffizier Gerhard Grunhagen of the 32nd Infantry Division, one of the divisions that had made the entire journey from Leningrad to Courland, left memoirs published in Germany in the 1980s. He described the autumn of 1944 as follows. The soldiers in his company understood there was no land route home. The company and battalion commanders understood this too. The division staff officers understood. But the order was to hold, and they held, because they had no other options. The hardest part, he wrote, was not the first month, nor even the second. The hardest part began in February of 1945, when it became clear that Berlin might fall before anyone evacuated them from this peninsula. Grunhagen described one detail that stuck in his memory. In December of 1944, an order arrived in his battalion to write off transport horses due to a shortage of fodder. The horses were slaughtered for meat. This was the moment when, for many soldiers in the trenches, something finally clicked into place. Cavalry and artillery horses are the Army's draft animals. When they are eaten, it means the Army no longer counts on mobility. It means the Army intends to winter where it stands. In March of 1945, according to the testimonies of several German officers, rumors began to circulate in units of Army Group Courland about negotiations through neutral intermediaries. Allegedly, the Soviet command would offer a surrender with guarantees. The rumors were false. There were no negotiations, but the very fact of their spread speaks volumes. People were looking for a way out where none existed. General Karl Hilpert, the last commander of Army Group Courland, described the situation in April of 1945 briefly in his interrogation testimony after the surrender. The troops were combat ready, prepared to fight, but they had no ammunition for a serious battle. There were men, there were positions, there was no ammunition. Was there an opportunity to conduct an organized evacuation? German military historians have debated this question for decades and continue to debate it now. Technically, yes. The German fleet in the Baltic, from September 1944 to January 1945, conducted several major naval evacuations. Operation Hannibal, which began in January 1945 and aimed to evacuate refugees and troops from East Prussia, demonstrated that the Baltic Fleet was capable of transporting hundreds of thousands of people, albeit with losses, albeit under horrific conditions, but capable. Over several months of Operation Hannibal, more than 1 million people were evacuated by sea. A figure difficult to comprehend, more than 1 million people from just one direction. 1 million people. That is more than 4 Courland pockets. But here too, the details are important. Operation Hannibal was conducted under conditions of almost complete Soviet air superiority over the Baltic. On the 30th of January 1945, the Soviet submarine S-13 under the command of Captain Third Rank Alexander Marinesco, sank the German liner Wilhelm Gustloff with refugees and personnel on board. Between 6,000 and 9,000 people perished, depending on the method of counting the number of people on the overloaded ship. One ship, one torpedo salvo, several thousand dead. Such was the price of a naval evacuation from the Baltic in the winter of 1945. But this price was paid. 1 million people were evacuated. Had a similar scale been applied to Courland 3 to 4 months earlier, under conditions of lesser Soviet air superiority, transport losses would have been lower. Evacuating 200,000 soldiers without heavy equipment, without supplies, just the men, would have required approximately 300,000 tons of transport capacity. That is roughly 200 voyages by a medium transport ship at full load. Over 2 to 3 months, this was feasible. In December of 1944, the staff of Army Group Courland prepared precisely such a calculation. The document is stored in the German military archives. The conclusion of the calculation: with the transport capacity available on the Baltic route at that time, 6 to 7 weeks to evacuate the main personnel. With the mobilization of additional civilian ships, 4 to 5 weeks. Not fantasy, a working estimate by the German staff. The calculation landed on the commander's desk. The commander sent it up the chain. Up top, they read it, and they answered with a refusal. There is another aspect of this story that rarely comes to the forefront when discussing the Courland pocket. It is the question of what exactly holding the Baltic states was supposed to achieve for Germany. Hitler and his inner circle appealed to several arguments. First, the Baltic states as a bridgehead for re-establishing contact with Finland. This argument collapsed on September 19, 1944, when Finland signed the armistice. The second, holding the port of Riga for supply and reinforcement. This argument collapsed on October 13th, when Riga was taken by Soviet troops. The third, psychological and political significance, not to surrender territory without a fight, not to let the Allies see weakness, to maintain the appearance of combat readiness. There was also a fourth argument, spoken of less often, but which in reality played a significant role. The access to the Baltic Sea in Courland gave the German Navy training grounds for preparing crews of the new generation of submarines, in particular Type 21 submarines, equipped with snorkels and capable of operating underwater significantly longer than their predecessors. Admiral Karl Donitz insisted that these submarines could change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic if deployed in sufficient numbers. Their training required the enclosed waters of the Baltic, the very waters covered by Army Group Courland. This argument was the only one listed that had any operational logic. But it too could not withstand a simple check. The Type 21 submarines were entering service too slowly, their construction was behind schedule, and they could not turn the tide of the war even in theory, because the war was being lost on the Eastern Front by that time, not in the Atlantic. Psychological and political arguments in war carry weight up to a certain point. When 215,000 combat-ready soldiers are trapped on a peninsula with no chance of influencing the outcome of the campaign, the political argument no longer outweighs operational reality. Historian David Glantz, author of Fundamental Studies on the Soviet-German War, relying on documents from the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, unequivocally stated in his works, "From an operational point of view, Army Group Courland existed from October 1944 as an isolated force, incapable of operational cooperation with the rest of the front and not influencing its course. Its sole function became tying down part of the Soviet forces, but at the cost of its own complete destruction as a combat unit." Now, about the meeting that could have changed everything and changed nothing. In January 1945, when Soviet troops were already on the Oder and the German Eastern Front was crumbling under the blows of the Vistula-Oder operation, Hitler convened a meeting where the question of the Courland troops was discussed again. The Wehrmacht command, including Chief of the General Staff Heinz Guderian, once again raised the issue of evacuating the army group by sea to strengthen the defense on the Berlin direction. Guderian prepared seriously. He had concrete figures: travel time from the Courland shores to Danzig, 48 hours at good speed, data on available transport vessels, calculations showing that 3 to 4 weeks of intensive shipments would allow evacuating the main part of the army group's combat-ready personnel. These were not abstract wishes, it was a plan. Hitler refused. The argument was the same: territory cannot be surrendered. Guderian, in his memoirs Panzer Leader, published in 1951, described this meeting as the moment when he finally understood no military arguments would be heard anymore. Decisions were not made based on operational logic. They were made according to a principle Guderian called map strategy, when the flags on the headquarters map are more important than the actual divisions those flags represent. The flag on Courland remained standing until the very end. The divisions it represented surrendered and spent the next decade in Soviet camps. The Baltic Operation of 1944, according to Soviet archival documents declassified and studied by historian Glantz and his Russian colleagues from the Institute of Military History, cost the Red Army about 124,000 irrecoverable losses, killed, died of wounds, and missing. Another about 320,000 sanitary losses, wounded, sick, frostbitten. This is the price of breaking through the Baltics, street fighting for Riga, and 6 attempts to break the Courland pocket on the move. 444,000 total losses for one operation. This is not a victory with little blood. This is a victory that was bought dearly, including because the German troops in Courland defended every meter of swamps and forests as if Berlin stood behind them. German losses in the Baltics from June to December 1944 are estimated by German military historiography at 50,000 killed and died, plus losses from disease and accidents. Equipment. Most of the armored vehicles of Army Group North were lost during the retreat, either destroyed or abandoned due to lack of fuel and spare parts. According to German accounting documents, at the time the pocket was closed, Army Group Courland had less than 150 operational tanks and self-propelled guns. This is less than the armament of a single Soviet tank army. Less than 150 machines against 800 Soviet ones, a ratio of 5 to 1. And this ratio could not be changed from within the pocket because new machines could not be brought in, and old ones were knocked out in every Soviet offensive. The final act of the Courland drama occurred on May 8, 1945. On this day, the act of unconditional surrender of Germany was signed in Reims. The war ended. Army Group Courland laid down its arms on May 9, 1945. General Hilpert personally signed the surrender order. By this time, about 180,000 personnel remained in the pocket. The rest had perished in 7 months of fighting, died from wounds or disease, or were evacuated by sea. 180,000 German soldiers emerged from the forests and trenches of Courland and laid down their arms on the shore of the Baltic Sea. Most of them went through Soviet captivity, harsh, long, with high mortality in the first post-war years. Many returned home only in the 50s. Some never returned at all. 180,000. Out of 215,000 who entered the pocket in the autumn of 1944. 35,000. The difference between those who entered the pocket and those who came out of it. 35,000 people who died for holding a flag on a map. What exactly were they defending all these 7 months? What specific military facility? What strategic line? What economically significant production? The answer is straightforward: none of the above. In Courland, there was nothing worth holding there for, neither the 18th Army nor the 16th, nor everything that remained of them by that time. No oil fields, no major military factories, no railway junctions critical for supplying the rest of the front. Only land, swamps, forests, and a line of trenches that led nowhere. The German military historian Karl-Heinz Frieser, author of a detailed study of Wehrmacht operations on the Eastern Front, published by the Military History Research Institute of the Bundeswehr, described the Courland pocket as a classic example of how a political decision, made contrary to operational logic, destroys not just an army, but the very capacity for any meaningful resistance elsewhere. The troops in Courland were needed neither for the defense of Berlin, nor for holding East Prussia, nor for anything else. They were needed only to continue existing within the pocket, as proof that Hitler had not decided to retreat. There is one detail in this story that speaks more than any operational analysis. When Guderian raised the question of evacuating Courland for the last time at a conference in January 1945, Hitler interrupted him mid-sentence. He took a pencil and pointed to the symbol of the army group Courland. "As long as it stands here, we do not retreat." After that, the meeting moved on to the next point. The divisions in the pocket did not learn of this. They knew it already. 13 divisions, fully equipped, combat-ready, with experienced commanders and trained soldiers, remained in the Courland forest from October 1944 to May 1945. During this time, on the Berlin direction, the Wehrmacht was throwing 17-year-old recruits and elderly Volkssturm militiamen into battle. It plugged breaches with battalions assembled from hospital wards and training units. It sent groups into counterattacks without a single tank or artillery support. In Courland stood 215,000 men. War does not reward stubbornness. It rewards precision, the ability to understand when a flag on the map is no longer worth anything, and to redeploy living people to where they can still change something. Those who cannot do this in time do not merely lose battles. They spend armies on holding emptiness. This is part 7 of 7.